What happens when loyalty collides with royal duty? When a trusted guard witnesses something so disturbing that it threatens the very foundation of the monarchy. For 37 years, Detective Inspector James Morrison served the crown with unwavering dedication. From protecting visiting dignitaries to safeguarding the royal family's most intimate moments, he thought he had seen everything. But nothing prepared him for what he would discover in the shadows of Windsor Castle on a cold February evening in 2024. The evidence he collected that night would expose a web of manipulation, jealousy, and power struggles that reaches the highest levels of the British royal family. His testimony reveals Prince William's desperate attempts to protect his wife Catherine from a threat so close to home that it shakes the very core of royal tradition. This is not just another palace scandal. This is the untold story of how one woman's obsession nearly destroyed the future of the monarchy, and how a loyal guard's courage to speak the truth changed everything. The names have been verified. The documents are real. The recordings exist. What you're about to read will change how you see the royal family forever. The grandfather clock in the East Wing corridor struck 11 as Detective Inspector James Morrison completed his final security check of the evening. After 37 years of service to the crown, these late-night rounds had become second nature to him. His footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors of Windsor Castle, each familiar creak and whisper of the ancient building telling its own story. James had witnessed countless royal dramas during his tenure. He had seen marriages bloom and wither, watched children grow into adults under the relentless scrutiny of the public eye, and protected secrets that would make front-page headlines if they ever saw daylight. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. Earlier that day, he had noticed unusual activity around the private quarters. Staff members whispering in corners, hurried phone calls behind closed doors, and, most telling of all, the strained expression on Prince William's face during the morning briefing. William had always been composed, even during the most challenging times, but today his jaw was clenched tight, and his usually warm blue eyes held a coldness that James had never seen before. As James approached the West Wing, where the family's private apartments were located, he heard voices coming from the library. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, which was unusual for this time of night. Protocol dictated that all common areas should be secured by 10 o'clock, but someone had clearly forgotten to lock the library properly. He approached carefully, his training taking over. Years of protecting the royal family had taught him to investigate any anomaly, no matter how small. As he drew closer, the voices became clearer, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "You need to understand, Sarah, this cannot continue." It was Prince William's voice, but stripped of its usual diplomatic tone. This was raw, angry, desperate. "I don't know what you're talking about, William. I'm only trying to help." The female voice was honey-sweet, but James detected something underneath it, something that made his instincts scream danger. "Help? You call what you're doing help?" William's voice rose slightly, then dropped to a harsh whisper. "Stay away from Catherine. I'm warning you." James positioned himself where he could see into the room through the gap in the doors. Prince William stood near the fireplace, his hands clenched at his sides. Across from him, in one of the leather armchairs, sat Lady Sarah Thornberry, a distant cousin who had recently returned to court after years abroad. Sarah was beautiful in the way that only aristocratic breeding could produce. Blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing an elegant midnight blue dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. But there was something in her posture, the way she held her head, that reminded James of a predator sizing up its prey. "William, darling, you're being paranoid," Sarah said, rising gracefully from her chair. "Catherine and I are becoming such good friends. She needs someone she can trust, someone who understands this life. Don't." William's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't you dare pretend this is about friendship. I know what you're doing, and I won't let you destroy her." Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, and James saw something flash across her face. Rage? Jealousy? Whatever it was disappeared so quickly, he almost thought he had imagined it. "Destroy her? William, I would never. You've been feeding information to the tabloids." William stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Don't deny it. I have proof." James felt his heart hammering in his chest. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for, but nothing could have prepared him for the emotional intensity of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a security threat. This was personal, family betrayal at the highest level. Sarah's laugh was like breaking crystal. Proof? What kind of proof could you possibly have? William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like photographs. Even from his position, James could see that Sarah's face went pale when she saw them. These were taken last Tuesday. You, having lunch with Marcus Fleming from the Sun. The same day that story about Catherine's private medical appointment appeared in the paper. William's voice was steady now, prosecutorial. The same appointment that only 5 people knew about. 5 people, Sarah. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. James found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the slightest sound might give away his presence. You have no idea what you're talking about, Sarah said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. I know exactly what I'm talking about. William moved to the desk and picked up a tablet, swiping to what appeared to be bank statements. £50,000, deposited into your account the day after Catherine's miscarriage story broke. Another $25,000 after the eating disorder rumors started circulating. James felt sick. He had been there when Catherine had lost the baby 2 months after their wedding announcement. He had seen the devastation on both William and Catherine's faces, the way they had clung to each other in their grief. To think that someone had profited from that pain was almost unbearable. Sarah stood frozen, her perfect composure finally cracking. You don't understand. I needed that money. The estate, the debts. I don't care about your financial problems. William's interruption was brutal in its simplicity. What I care about is my wife's well-being. What I care about is the fact that you've been systematically destroying her reputation for money. She doesn't deserve you, Sarah whispered, and there it was. The truth, naked and ugly in the elegant library. She's not one of us, William. She doesn't understand this world, this responsibility. I could help you so much more than she ever could. The pieces clicked into place for James. This wasn't just about money. This was about obsession, about a woman who believed she deserved a place that had never been hers to claim. William stared at Sarah for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with disappointment. I loved you like a sister, Sarah. We all did. But you've chosen your path. William, please. We can work this out. I can make things right with Catherine. I can, no. The single word fell like a judge's gavel. Security will escort you from the premises tomorrow morning. Your access to the family is permanently revoked. If you come near Catherine again, if you so much as speak her name to another journalist, I will personally ensure that your financial crimes are investigated to the fullest extent of the law. Sarah's face went white. You wouldn't dare. Try me. The threat hung in the air between them, and James could see that Sarah finally understood the gravity of her situation. This wasn't the gentle, diplomatic William that the public knew. This was a man protecting his family with everything he had. Sarah gathered herself, smoothing down her dress and lifting her chin with what remained of her dignity. This isn't over, William. Yes, it is. She walked toward the doors, and James quickly stepped back into the shadows, pressing himself against the wall as she swept past. He caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something else, the acrid scent of fear and desperation. When her footsteps faded down the corridor, James waited several minutes before quietly retreating to his office. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out his incident report tablet. This was bigger than a simple security breach. This was potential treason, betrayal of the crown at the most intimate level. But, as he began to type his report, James realized he was faced with an impossible choice. Protocol demanded that he report everything he had witnessed, but doing so would expose Prince William to scrutiny he didn't deserve. William was protecting his wife and his family, exactly what any good man would do. James stared at the blank screen for a long time, weighing duty against conscience, protocol against humanity. Outside his window, the lights of London twinkled in the distance. Millions of people sleeping peacefully, unaware that their future king was fighting a very private war to protect the woman he loved. Finally, James made his decision. He would document everything, but he would also protect the family he had served so faithfully. Some truths were too important to bury, but They were also too dangerous to expose without careful consideration. As he began to write, the grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking not just the end of another day, but the beginning of what would become the most challenging case of his career. Little did he know that Sarah Thornberry's threat, "This isn't over," would prove to be more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the library, and James Morrison found himself walking a tightrope between duty and discretion. He had submitted a carefully worded incident report that mentioned irregular access patterns and potential security concerns without revealing the full scope of what he had witnessed. But his conscience wouldn't let him rest. The morning briefing was more tense than usual. Prince William appeared composed, but James could see the strain around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when certain topics were mentioned. Catherine, meanwhile, seemed unusually subdued. She smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, but there was a fragility to her that hadn't been there before. After the briefing, James made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to his regular duties, he decided to conduct his own informal investigation. If Sarah Thornberry was indeed feeding information to the press, there would be evidence, and James had 37 years of experience in finding evidence. He started with the security logs. Every person who entered or left the royal residences was tracked, and every electronic device usage was monitored for security purposes. What he found made his stomach turn. Over the past 6 months, Sarah's access card had been used during 17 different instances when sensitive family information later appeared in tabloids. The pattern was undeniable. She would visit, usually for what appeared to be legitimate family functions, and within 48 hours, private details about the royal family would surface in the press. But the most damaging discovery came when James cross-referenced Sarah's phone records, which were monitored as part of standard security protocols for all family members with access to sensitive information. The records showed multiple calls to a number registered to Marcus Fleming, the tabloid journalist William had mentioned. The calls always happened within hours of Sarah's visits to the palace. James printed the relevant pages and locked them in his personal safe. This was evidence of systematic betrayal, but he needed to understand the full scope before deciding how to proceed. He also needed to know just how much damage had already been done to Catherine. His opportunity came that afternoon when Catherine's personal assistant, Emma Richardson, knocked on his office door. Emma had worked for the royal family for 8 years and was known for her absolute discretion and loyalty to Catherine. "Inspector Morrison, do you have a moment?" Emma's voice was strained, and James could see she had been crying. "Of course, come in. Please, sit down." Emma closed the door behind her and took a seat across from his desk. She clutched a tissue in her hands, twisting it nervously as she struggled to find the words. "I don't know who else to talk to about this," she began. "It's about Catherine. She's not doing well, Inspector, and I think someone is deliberately trying to hurt her." James leaned forward, his professional instincts taking over. "What makes you say that?" "The stories in the press, they're so specific, so cruel. Details about her private conversations, her medical appointments, even things she said to me in confidence." Emma's voice cracked. "Yesterday, she asked me if I had been talking to journalists. She thinks someone on her own staff is betraying her." The pain in Emma's voice was evident. James could see how much she cared for Catherine, how devastating it was to watch her employer and friends suffer from this systematic campaign of leaked information. "Has Catherine mentioned anyone in particular that she suspects?" James asked carefully. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "She mentioned Lady Sarah. Said that Sarah always seems to know things, asks very specific questions about Catherine's schedule, her health, her relationship with William. But then, Sarah is so sympathetic, so understanding, that Catherine feels guilty for suspecting her." "What kind of questions does Lady Sarah ask?" "Things like whether Catherine is seeing any doctors, what she talks about with William in private, whether she's planning any solo engagements." At first, it seemed like normal curiosity, the kind of questions family members might ask. But now, Emma trailed off, then looked directly at James. "Inspector, I've seen the phone records for the guest quarters where Sarah stays when she visits. She makes a lot of calls to London numbers, always right after spending time with Catherine." James felt his pulse quicken. Emma was describing the same pattern he had discovered in his own investigation, but from a different angle. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture of calculated betrayal that went beyond simple gossip. Emma, I need you to think carefully. Has Sarah ever asked you directly about Catherine's private matters? Emma's eyes widened. Actually, yes. 2 weeks ago, she cornered me in the kitchen and asked about Catherine's eating habits. Said she was concerned because Catherine looked thin. She asked specific questions about what Catherine ate for breakfast, whether she had been exercising more, if I had noticed any changes in her mood. And what happened after that conversation? The eating disorder story broke 3 days later. It was so detailed, so specific. They even mentioned Catherine's favorite breakfast foods and her workout routine. Emma's face went pale as she connected the dots. Oh my God, I told Sarah all of that. James reached across the desk and placed a reassuring hand on Emma's arm. This isn't your fault. Sarah is trained in manipulation. She knew exactly how to make her questions seem caring and innocent. But Catherine trusted me, and you did nothing wrong. James interrupted firmly. But I need your help now to make this right. Are you willing to help me gather evidence against Sarah? Emma straightened up, her grief transforming into determination. Whatever it takes. Over the next 2 hours, James and Emma went through every interaction Emma could remember with Sarah. They created a timeline that correlated Sarah's questions with subsequent press stories, and the pattern was devastating in its clarity. Sarah had systematically extracted information about Catherine's private life, her insecurities, her medical concerns, and her relationship with William. She had then sold these details to tabloid journalists, spinning them into stories designed to damage Catherine's reputation and emotional well-being. But the investigation took a darker turn when Emma remembered something else. There's something else, Inspector. Something I almost forgot because it seemed so strange at the time. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. 3 months ago, Sarah asked me about Catherine's medication. She said she noticed Catherine seemed tired and wondered if she was taking anything for anxiety or depression. James felt ice in his veins. What did you tell her? I said that Catherine's medical information was private, that I wouldn't discuss it even if I knew. But Sarah kept pushing, said she was only concerned because she had experience with anxiety medication herself and wanted to help. Did Catherine ever mention taking any medication to you? Never. But the next week, there was a story in the press about Catherine seeking treatment for postpartum depression. The timing was so strange because Catherine wasn't pregnant, had never been treated for depression, and the story came out of nowhere. James realized they had uncovered something even more sinister than he had originally suspected. Sarah wasn't just leaking true information. She was potentially fabricating stories when real information wasn't juicy enough for the tabloids. Emma, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to be very careful about it. I want you to keep a detailed log of every conversation you have with Sarah from now on. Write down her questions, note the timing, and report back to me immediately if she asks about anything particularly sensitive. You think she's going to keep trying? James thought about the confrontation he had witnessed, about Sarah's parting words to William. I think this is far from over, and I think we need to be prepared for her to escalate. That evening, James sat in his office reviewing all the evidence he had gathered. The pattern of betrayal was clear, but he was also beginning to see something else. A systematic campaign designed not just to embarrass Catherine, but to potentially destabilize her marriage and her position in the royal family. The fabricated depression story was particularly troubling. If Sarah was willing to invent medical conditions for media consumption, what else might she be planning? James had seen enough palace intrigue over the years to know that this kind of psychological warfare could have devastating consequences. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. Detective Chief Inspector Rachel Hawthorne answered on the second ring. James, it's been ages. What can I do for you? Rachel, I need a favor. A big one. And I need it to stay completely off the books. There was a pause on the other end. How big? The kind that could affect the stability of the monarchy. Jesus, James. What have you stumbled into? James looked at the files spread across his desk, at the timeline of betrayal and manipulation that painted a picture of something far more dangerous than simple gossip. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know it's not over. I know it's going to get worse before it gets better." As James began to outline the situation for his old colleague, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. Sarah Thornberry had been exposed and expelled from the inner circle, but wounded animals were often the most dangerous. And everything James had learned about Sarah suggested she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Outside his window, London sparkled in the darkness, unaware that a battle for the heart of the royal family was just beginning. Detective Chief Inspector Rachel Hawthorne arrived at Windsor Castle the following morning disguised as a new security consultant. Her cover story was that she was conducting a routine review of palace security protocols, but, in reality, she was there to help James build an airtight case against Sarah Thornberry. Rachel was everything James remembered: sharp, intuitive, and absolutely relentless when she caught the scent of corruption. She had built her reputation by taking down white-collar criminals who thought their social connections made them untouchable. If anyone could help navigate the delicate political aspects of this case, it was Rachel. "This is bigger than I thought," Rachel said quietly as she reviewed the evidence in James's office. "We're not just talking about breach of privacy or even simple extortion. This is systematic psychological warfare against a member of the royal family." James nodded grimly. "And I don't think she's finished. Sarah Thornberry strikes me as someone who doesn't accept defeat easily. Tell me about her background." James pulled up Sarah's file on his computer. Lady Sarah Thornberry, 34 years old, daughter of the late Earl of Wessingham. Educated at Oxford, spent 5 years working in public relations in New York before returning to London last year after her father's death. She inherited significant debts along with the title, which explains her financial motivation. What about her connection to the royal family? Her grandmother was a second cousin to the late Queen Mother. It's a distant relationship, but it was enough to gain her access to family functions. William apparently remembered her fondly from childhood gatherings and was sympathetic about her father's death. Rachel studied photographs of Sarah, noting the polished appearance and calculated smile. "She's beautiful, well-connected, and desperate. That's a dangerous combination." "There's more," James said. "Emma Richardson has been monitoring Sarah's attempts to maintain contact. Sarah has called Catherine's private line 6 times since she was banned from the premises. Catherine hasn't answered, but the calls show that Sarah isn't giving up." "What about the financial trail?" "That's where it gets interesting." James opened another file. "The payments from the tabloids stopped after William confronted her, but I've traced other deposits to her account. Larger amounts, from offshore sources that we haven't been able to identify yet." Rachel's expression darkened. "Someone else is funding her operations now. This isn't just about money anymore. Someone wants to see Catherine destroyed, and they're willing to pay for it." The investigation was interrupted by a knock on James's door. Emma Richardson entered, looking pale and shaken. "Inspector Morrison, I need to show you something immediately." She handed James her phone, which displayed a text message thread. "Sarah sent this to Catherine this morning. Catherine forwarded it to me because she didn't know what to make of it." James read the messages aloud for Rachel's benefit. "Catherine, darling, I know William has poisoned you against me, but I only ever tried to help. I have information about threats against you that you need to know about. Meet me for coffee today. There are people who want to hurt you, and only I can protect you. Please trust me. Sarah." The follow-up message was even more disturbing. "If you won't meet with me, I'll have to take my concerns to the press. I can't stand by and watch while you're in danger. The public deserves to know what's really happening behind palace walls." Rachel leaned back in her chair. Classic manipulation. She's using Catherine's fear for her safety to try to regain access, and threatening exposure if she doesn't comply. "It's worse than that," Emma said quietly. "Catherine is actually considering meeting with her. She's terrified that there might be real threats she doesn't know about. She asked me to set up a security review with you, Inspector Morrison." James felt his blood pressure spike. Absolutely not. Under no circumstances should Catherine meet with Sarah alone. But what if Sarah is telling the truth? What if there are threats we don't know about? Rachel stood up, her expression grim. "Then, we use this to our advantage. If Sarah wants a meeting, we'll give her one. But it will be on our terms, with full surveillance, and it will be the last mistake she ever makes." Over the next several hours, James, Rachel, and Emma crafted a carefully planned operation. Catherine would agree to meet Sarah, but the meeting would take place in a secure location with hidden cameras and recording equipment. They would finally have indisputable evidence of Sarah's manipulation tactics. The plan required Catherine's cooperation, which meant bringing her into their confidence about the investigation. That evening, James and Rachel met with Prince William and Catherine in their private sitting room. Catherine listened in stunned silence as they laid out the evidence of Sarah's betrayal. When they finished, she was pale but resolute. "I knew something was wrong," Catherine said quietly. "Every time I spent time with Sarah, I felt drained afterward. She had a way of asking questions that made me doubt myself, made me wonder if I was imagining threats that didn't exist." William took his wife's hand, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. "I should have protected you from this sooner." "You couldn't have known," Catherine replied. "She was very good at what she did. She made her manipulation feel like caring." Rachel leaned forward. "Catherine, we need your help to stop her. But I want you to understand the risks. This meeting could be emotionally difficult, and we don't know what Sarah might be capable of when she realizes she's been trapped." "What do you need me to do?" James outlined the plan. Catherine would text Sarah agreeing to a private meeting at a small cafe in Kensington. The location would be cleared of other customers and fitted with surveillance equipment. Catherine would wear a hidden microphone, and plainclothes security would be positioned throughout the area. "The goal is to get her to admit to her activities on record," Rachel explained. "We need her to confess to selling information to the press, and, if possible, to reveal who is currently funding her operations." Catherine nodded firmly. "When do we do this?" "Tomorrow afternoon. Sarah's desperation is working in our favor. She'll want to meet as soon as possible." The next morning, Catherine sent the agreed-upon text message. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said. You're right that I need to know about any threats. Can you meet me at Café Luna in Kensington at 3 p.m. today? Please come alone. Catherine." Sarah's response came within minutes. "Thank God you're listening to reason. I have so much to tell you. See you at 3. Come alone, and don't tell William. This is for your own safety. Sarah." The speed of her response and the instruction to keep the meeting secret from William confirmed everything the investigators suspected about Sarah's true motives. James spent the morning coordinating with the technical team to ensure the surveillance equipment was undetectable. The cafe owner, who had been briefed on the security situation, was cooperative but nervous about hosting such a high-stakes operation. Rachel positioned herself at a table with a clear view of where Catherine and Sarah would sit. James remained in a surveillance van outside, coordinating the operation through hidden earpieces worn by all team members. At 2:45 p.m., Catherine arrived at the cafe, looking every inch the composed royal despite the emotional turmoil she was undoubtedly feeling. She ordered tea and settled at the designated table, checking her watch and waiting. Sarah arrived exactly on time, looking around nervously before approaching Catherine's table. She was elegantly dressed as always, but James could see the strain in her posture, the way her eyes darted around the cafe as if looking for threats or witnesses. "Catherine, darling, thank you so much for coming," Sarah said, leaning in to kiss Catherine's cheek. "I was so worried about you." "You said there were threats I should know about," Catherine replied, her voice carefully neutral. "What kind of threats?" Sarah glanced around again, then leaned closer to Catherine. "There are people in the palace, people close to you, who are feeding information to hostile foreign governments. Your private communications, your security details, even your medical information, it's all being sold to the highest bidder." James felt his heart rate increase. This was a completely different story from what they had expected. Either Sarah was making up an elaborate lie, or there was another layer to this conspiracy that they hadn't discovered. Catherine's training kicked in. Instead of showing shock or fear, she maintained her composure and pressed for more details. Who is doing this? I can't say names here. It's too dangerous. But I have proof, documents, recordings. People you trust, Catherine. People William trusts." Sarah's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "That's why I had to get this information out through other channels. The traditional security apparatus is compromised." Rachel, listening through her earpiece, realized what Sarah was doing. She was reframing her betrayal as patriotic whistleblowing, trying to make Catherine believe that selling secrets to tabloids was actually a way of protecting royal security. Sarah, Catherine said carefully, when you say you got information out through other channels, do you mean the press stories? Sarah nodded emphatically. I had to find a way to expose the real threats without alerting the compromised security personnel. The stories about your private life were regrettable, but they were necessary to establish credibility with journalists who could help expose the real criminals. It was a masterful performance, James had to admit. Sarah was rewriting history, transforming her betrayal into heroism, her greed into sacrifice for the greater good. But Catherine was ready for this. That's very brave of you, Sarah. But I need to understand exactly what you did so I can evaluate the threats properly. Can you walk me through how you gathered this information and who you shared it with? And, with that simple question, the trap began to close. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly not expecting Catherine's direct question about her methods. For a moment, her confident facade cracked, and James could see the calculating mind behind it working frantically to maintain her cover story. Well, Sarah began, smoothing her hair nervously. It started when I noticed inconsistencies in security protocols. People who had access to information they shouldn't have, conversations that seemed to be recorded when they should have been private. Catherine nodded encouragingly, her training in diplomatic interrogation techniques serving her well. That must have been very concerning. What kind of conversations? Your personal discussions with William, your private medical consultations, even your conversations with staff members like Emma. I realized that someone was systematically gathering intelligence about your daily life. James, listening from the surveillance van, felt his respect for Catherine grow. She was masterfully allowing Sarah to dig herself deeper while maintaining the appearance of concern and gratitude. So when you noticed these security breaches, what did you do? Catherine asked. I knew I couldn't trust the normal channels. If there were compromised individuals in the security apparatus, reporting through official channels would only alert them that I was onto their scheme. Sarah leaned forward conspiratorially. So I started documenting everything myself. I kept records of who had access to sensitive information, when it was accessed, and how it appeared in the public domain. That must have been difficult for you to gather that information. Sarah's mask slipped completely for a moment, and her true personality showed through. Actually, it was easier than I expected. People trust me because of my family connections. Emma, for instance, she was so willing to share details about your daily routine because she thought I was genuinely concerned about your well-being. Catherine's hand tightened slightly around her teacup, but her voice remained steady. So Emma was one of your sources of information? One of many, Sarah said, pride creeping into her voice. I had to build relationships with multiple staff members to get a complete picture of the security vulnerabilities. Your personal protection officers, your medical staff, even your hairdresser, they all had pieces of the puzzle. Rachel, monitoring from her table across the cafe, felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah wasn't just confessing to gathering information. She was boasting about her systematic manipulation of people who trusted her. And once you had this information, Catherine continued, how did you decide to expose it through the press? Sarah paused, realizing she was approaching dangerous territory. But her narcissism and her need to justify her actions pushed her forward. I had to find journalists who were brave enough to publish sensitive information in the national interest. Marcus Fleming from The Sun was one of the few who understood the gravity of the situation. Marcus Fleming, Catherine repeated thoughtfully. And how did you approach him? I started by giving him smaller pieces of information to test his commitment to the truth. Details about your daily routine, your personal preferences, things that seemed trivial but were actually evidence of security lapses. James felt sick listening to Sarah describe her betrayal as patriotic duty. She was so deep into her own delusion that she seemed to genuinely believe her revisionist history. These smaller pieces of information, Catherine said, like details about my medical appointments? Exactly. Sarah's eyes lit up. The fact that your private medical information was so easily accessible proved that your security was compromised. By revealing these breaches publicly, I forced the palace to acknowledge that there were problems. And the stories about my eating habits, my exercise routine, all evidence of surveillance that shouldn't have existed. Someone was monitoring your most intimate daily activities, Catherine. The only way to stop it was to expose it. Catherine took a sip of her tea, using the moment to compose herself before asking the question that would seal Sarah's fate. Sarah, I'm grateful for your concern about my security, but I need to understand the financial aspect of this. Were you compensated by these journalists for the information you provided? Sarah's face went pale. Compensated? Catherine, I'm not judging you, Catherine said quickly. I understand that exposing security breaches probably put you at personal risk. If you received payment, it might have been to cover your expenses or compensate you for that risk. The lie came so naturally to Sarah that James almost believed she had convinced herself it was true. Well, yes, there were payments. But they weren't for the information itself. They were to cover my investigation costs. Following people, documenting security breaches, it's expensive work. The payments barely covered my expenses. How much were these expense reimbursements? Sarah hesitated, clearly realizing she was trapped but unable to see a way out. It varied. Sometimes a few £1,000s, sometimes more, depending on the complexity of the security breach I was documenting. And these payments came from the Sun? From various sources. Some journalists, some concerned private citizens who wanted to support my investigation into palace security. Catherine leaned forward slightly. Private citizens? Can you tell me who they were? This was the moment James had been waiting for. If Sarah revealed her current financial backers, it might lead them to whoever was orchestrating this campaign against Catherine. I can't reveal their names, Sarah said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. They're powerful people who could be endangered if their support for my investigation became public. But surely you can give me some general idea? If these people are concerned about my safety, I should know who they are so I can work with them. Sarah's composure finally broke completely. The weight of her lies, the pressure of maintaining her cover story, and the growing realization that she was being recorded all combined to shatter her carefully constructed facade. Catherine, I think you're misunderstanding my motives here, she said, her voice rising slightly. I've risked everything to protect you. I've sacrificed my reputation, my relationships with the family, even my financial security to expose the threats against you. I appreciate that, Catherine said calmly. But I need specifics if I'm going to take action based on your information. The specifics are classified. I can't just give you names and details over coffee in a public cafe. James realized that Sarah was beginning to panic. Her story was falling apart, and she was starting to lash out defensively. Sarah, Catherine said gently, I think there might be some confusion here. Are you saying that you've been investigating security breaches, or that you've been creating security breaches to expose vulnerabilities? The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Sarah stared at Catherine, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find an answer that wouldn't incriminate her further. What I've been doing is complex. You wouldn't understand the methodologies involved in counterintelligence work. Try me, Catherine said simply. Sarah stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. This was a mistake. I thought you were mature enough to handle the truth about your situation, but, clearly, you're not ready to face reality. Sarah, please sit down. I want to understand. No. Sarah's voice carried across the cafe, causing other patrons to look in their direction. You want to understand? Then, understand this. You don't deserve William. You don't deserve this life. You're a commoner who stumbled into royalty, and you have no idea how to protect yourself or your family. The mask was completely gone now, and the real Sarah Thornberry stood revealed, bitter, jealous, and consumed with a sense of entitlement that bordered on delusional. You think William loves you, but he only married you because he couldn't have who he really wanted. Someone who understands this world, someone who was born to it, someone who could actually help him instead of being a constant liability. Catherine remained seated, her composure intact even as Sarah's venom washed over her. And who did William really want, Sarah? Me. The word exploded out of her like a gunshot. He wanted me. We understood each other. We had history. We had connections that you could never comprehend. But you seduced him with your innocent act, your common touch, your pathetic neediness. James felt his heart stop. This wasn't just about money or attention. This was about a woman who had convinced herself that she deserved a life that had never been offered to her. Sarah continued her rant, oblivious to the fact that she was destroying herself with every word. So yes, I sold your secrets. Yes, I took money from journalists. Yes, I made up stories when the truth wasn't interesting enough. Because you deserve to suffer the way you've made me suffer. The confession was complete, recorded in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. But Sarah wasn't finished. And it's not over, Catherine. It will never be over. There are people out there who see you for what you really are, a fraud, a pretender, a woman who doesn't belong in the world you've stolen your way into. They're willing to pay very well for information that proves it. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, turning back one last time to deliver her final threat. Enjoy your fairy tale while it lasts, because I promise you, it's going to end. As Sarah stormed out of the cafe, James coordinated the plainclothes officers to follow her discreetly. But the most important work was already done. They had everything they needed to destroy Sarah Thornberry's credibility and potentially uncover the broader conspiracy she had hinted at. Catherine sat motionless at her table, the weight of Sarah's hatred and jealousy settling over her like a cold blanket. She had suspected that Sarah's actions were driven by more than greed, but hearing the depth of her delusion and malice was still shocking. Rachel approached Catherine's table and sat down quietly. "Are you all right?" Catherine nodded slowly. "I think so. But, Rachel, what she said about other people willing to pay for information about me, do you think that's true?" "I think it's very true," Rachel replied grimly. "And I think our investigation is just beginning." For the aftermath of Sarah's public breakdown moved swiftly. Within 6 hours of her confession at the cafe, James Morrison had compiled a comprehensive evidence package that included audio recordings, financial records, phone logs, and witness statements from multiple palace staff members who had been manipulated by Sarah over the previous months. Rachel Hawthorne worked through the night with her cybercrime unit to trace the offshore payments Sarah had received. What they discovered was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The money was coming from a consortium of foreign media companies with known connections to hostile intelligence services, suggesting that Sarah's betrayal had evolved from personal revenge into something approaching espionage. Prince William was briefed on the investigation's findings at dawn in his private office. James had never seen the future king so angry. William's hands shook as he reviewed the evidence, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and, finally, a cold determination that reminded James why this man was trained to lead a nation. "How long has this been going on?" William asked, his voice barely controlled. "The financial records show payments dating back 8 months, James replied. "But, based on our analysis of press coverage, Sarah's activities may have started as early as a year ago, initially for smaller amounts from domestic tabloids." "A year," William repeated, staring out the window toward the gardens where Catherine was taking her morning walk with their protection officers. "She's been systematically destroying my wife's reputation for a year, and we never suspected." Rachel stepped forward. "Your Royal Highness, with respect, you weren't meant to suspect. Sarah is a professional manipulator. She used her family connections, her aristocratic background, and, most importantly, your own kindness and trust against you." William turned back to them, and James saw something new in his expression, not just anger, but a cold calculation that spoke to the monarch he would someday become. "What are our options for prosecution?" "Multiple charges," Rachel replied. "Breach of confidence, fraud, obtaining money by deception, computer misuse violations for accessing palace communication systems, and potentially charges under the Official Secrets Act if we can prove she shared classified security information." "And the foreign connections? That's where it gets complicated. We have evidence of payments from offshore accounts linked to foreign media companies, but proving direct intelligence service involvement would require cooperation from international law enforcement agencies. It could take years." William was quiet for several minutes, processing the information. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of royal authority. "I want her prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But, more importantly, I want her completely discredited publicly. She spent months destroying Catherine's reputation with lies and manipulation. I want the truth to destroy hers." James and Rachel exchanged glances. What William was asking for was legally complex, but morally clear. Sarah Thornberry had waged psychological warfare against the crown itself. She deserved to face the consequences. The prosecution moved forward with unprecedented speed. Within a week, Sarah was arrested at her London apartment on multiple charges of fraud and breach of confidence. The evidence against her was so overwhelming that her legal team immediately began discussing plea bargains. But the real justice came in the form of public exposure. James worked with the palace press office to craft a carefully worded statement that revealed the scope of Sarah's betrayal without compromising ongoing security investigations. The statement detailed how a trusted family member had systematically sold private information for financial gain, fabricated stories about Catherine's health and well-being, and ultimately revealed herself to be motivated by personal jealousy and delusion. The press, ironically enough, turned on Sarah with the same viciousness they had previously directed at Catherine. The woman who had fed them secrets for months was now portrayed as an unstable fantasist who had betrayed the trust of the royal family for money and attention. The revelation that many of the most damaging stories about Catherine had been fabricated or exaggerated caused a broader reckoning within the tabloid industry. Several editors were forced to resign, and new guidelines were implemented for verifying sources of royal-related stories. But the most important healing happened privately, within the royal family itself. Catherine, who had spent months doubting her own judgment and wondering if she was somehow to blame for the negative coverage, finally understood that she had been the victim of a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation. Emma Richardson, who had been devastated to learn how her innocent conversations with Sarah had been weaponized, found peace in knowing that her information had ultimately helped expose Sarah's crimes. She became even more protective of Catherine, but without the paranoia that had characterized their relationship during Sarah's campaign of harassment. The investigation into Sarah's foreign financial backers continued for months, eventually revealing a sophisticated network designed to destabilize public confidence in the British royal family. While the full scope of the conspiracy might never be publicly revealed, the security services now had the information they needed to protect against similar attacks in the future. Sarah herself pled guilty to multiple charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She received 3 years in prison, a substantial fine, and a lifetime ban from contact with any member of the royal family. Her titles were stripped, and her remaining assets were seized to pay restitution to the various parties she had defrauded. In her final court appearance, Sarah showed no remorse for her actions. She maintained that she had been motivated by genuine concern for royal security, and that Catherine remained unworthy of her position. The judge, in sentencing her, noted that Sarah's complete lack of insight into her crimes suggested a deep-seated psychological instability that made her a continued threat to public safety. 6 months after Sarah's arrest, James Morrison stood in the same corridor where he had first overheard the confrontation between William and Sarah. The grandfather clock chimed 11, just as it had that night. But the atmosphere in the palace was completely different. Catherine had emerged from the ordeal stronger and more confident. The revelation that her difficulties had been artificially created by a malicious conspiracy had freed her from months of self-doubt and anxiety. She threw herself into her royal duties with renewed vigor, and her popularity with the public soared as the truth about Sarah's manipulation became widely known. Prince William, meanwhile, had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of misplaced trust and the importance of protecting his family from threats both obvious and subtle. The experience had hardened him in some ways, but it had also deepened his appreciation for Catherine's strength and resilience. James received a personal commendation from the king for his role in exposing Sarah's betrayal and protecting the integrity of the royal family. But the recognition he valued most came from Catherine herself, who took time to personally thank him for his discretion and dedication during the investigation. "You could have handled this very differently," Catherine told him during a private meeting in her sitting room. "You could have followed protocol and reported everything immediately, which might have created a scandal that damaged the family regardless of the truth. Instead, you chose to investigate carefully and protect us while building a case for justice. I want you to know how much that means to me." James, who had spent 37 years serving the crown, found himself more moved by Catherine's gratitude than by any official recognition he had received. This was why he had dedicated his life to royal protection, not just to shield the family from physical threats, but to preserve their ability to serve the nation with dignity and integrity. As the investigation formally closed, James reflected on the lessons learned from the Sarah Thornberry affair. The threat to the royal family had not come from foreign enemies or political extremists, but from within their own circle of trust. It had been motivated not by ideology or financial desperation, but by personal jealousy and delusion. The experience had shown that the greatest threats to the monarchy might not always be the ones they were trained to expect. Sometimes, the enemy wore a familiar face, spoke with an aristocratic accent, and hid behind claims of loyalty and concern. These threats were harder to detect, but potentially more dangerous because they exploited the very qualities, trust, kindness, and family loyalty, that made the royal family human and relatable. But the affair had also demonstrated the strength of the institution itself. When faced with a sophisticated campaign of psychological manipulation and character assassination, the royal family had not crumbled or turned against each other. Instead, they had worked together with their loyal staff to uncover the truth and seek justice through proper legal channels. James looked out his window at the London skyline, where millions of people went about their daily lives, most of them unaware of the drama that had played out behind palace walls. The stability they took for granted, the continuity of democratic institutions, the reliability of constitutional monarchy, depended on the dedication of people willing to protect these systems from threats both foreign and domestic. Lady Sarah Thornberry had believed that her aristocratic birth entitled her to a life and a position that had never been hers to claim. When reality failed to match her expectations, she had chosen to blame others rather than accept responsibility for her own choices. Her story served as a reminder that privilege without purpose, entitlement without earning, and ambition without ethics were a dangerous combination. The truth, as James had learned over his decades of service, was usually more complex and more interesting than the stories people told themselves to justify their actions. Sarah had told herself that she was protecting Catherine, when in reality, she was destroying her. She had convinced herself that she deserved William's love, when she had never truly earned his respect. She had believed that her betrayal was patriotic, when it was actually treasonous. But the truth had prevailed, as it usually did when good people were willing to work patiently and carefully to uncover it. Justice had been served, not through scandal or public spectacle, but through proper investigation and legal process. As James prepared to leave his office that evening, he smiled, thinking about the future. Catherine would continue to grow into her role, supported by a husband who had learned how far he would go to protect her. William would someday be king, strengthened by the knowledge that he could face even the most personal betrayals and emerge with his integrity intact. And somewhere in London, Sarah Thornberry was beginning to learn that the consequences of her choices would last far longer than the temporary satisfaction of her revenge. The fairy tale she had tried so hard to destroy would continue, while her own story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of jealousy, entitlement, and the belief that being born into privilege excused any action taken to maintain it. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in the life of the royal family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to serve the people of Britain with dignity and honor. And James Morrison would be there, as he had been for 37 years, protecting not just the people he served, but the values and institutions they represented.